Hello, mathematicians. Today we're going to be learning about fractions and decimals, more specifically about comparing fractions and decimals by converting to decimals. To get us started, we have 2/4 and we have 5/10. Now, 2/4 is written in fraction form and 5/10 is written as a decimal. So what we're going to do is we're going to convert 2/4 to a decimal so that we could compare. In order to do that, we're going to have to divide the numerator by the denominator, meaning that the numerator goes on the inside and the denominator goes on the outside. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 4 go into 2? Well, it doesn't. So we're going to put a 0 and then add a decimal point with another 0 afterwards, and then make sure you bring up the decimal point as well. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 4 go into 20? Now, ignore the decimal point when we're dividing, just make sure you bring it up. So 4 goes into 20 5 times, and that's because 4 times 5 is equal to 20. So we're going to write that underneath and then subtract. 20 minus 20 is 0, so we do not get a remainder. That means that 2/4 is equal to 5/10. So we're going to rewrite 2/4 down there as 5/10. We're going to bring down this 5/10, and 5/10 is equal to 5/10, meaning that 2/4 is equal to 5/10. So let's do another example. Here we have 11 over 25, and here we have 45/100. Now, in order to compare these, we're going to make sure that both of them are decimals. We have a fraction, and we have a decimal here, so we're going to leave this one alone. And then we're going to use division to convert this to a decimal. So, 11 goes on the inside, our numerator, and then our denominator goes on the outside. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 25 go into 1? Well, it doesn't. So then we ask ourselves, how many times does 25 go into 11? And it also doesn't, so we're going to put a 0, add a decimal point after the 11, and add another 0 here so we can keep dividing. Make sure you bring up the decimal point. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 25 go into 110? So 25 goes into 110 4 times, and that's because 25 times 4 is equal to 100. And that's the closest we could get to 110 without going over. So underneath, we're going to write 100, and then we are going to subtract. 110 minus 100 is 10. So then we're going to add another 0 and bring it down. And then ask ourselves, how many times does 25 go into 100? Well, 25 goes into 100 4 times because 25 times 4 is equal to 100. So we're going to write that down and subtract. 100 minus 100 is 0. So we don't have anything left over. So 11 over 25 is equal to 44/100. So I'm going to write that down there and then bring down the 45/100. Now, if we're looking at both of these decimals, 44/100 is less than 45/100. So 11 over 25 is less than 45/100. All right, so now let's compare 1/3 and 3/10. We're going to take the fraction and convert it to a decimal in order to compare. So we're going to do long division, where we're going to put our numerator on the inside and our denominator on the outside. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 1? Well, 3 doesn't go into 1, so we're going to put a 0, and then a decimal point, another 0, and bring up the decimal point. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 10? 3 goes into 10 3 times because 3 times 3 is 9, and that's as close as we can get to 10 without going over. So then we're going to subtract. 10 minus 9 is equal to 1. Because we have a remainder, let's go ahead and add another 0. We're going to bring that down, and then we have 10 again. And we ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 10? 3 goes into 10 3 times because 3 times 3 is equal to 9. So we're going to write that, and then we're going to subtract. 10 minus 9 is equal to 1. And if you notice, there's a pattern now. So we're going to add a 0, bring it down, and ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 10? 3 goes into 10 3 times, so we're going to subtract again by 9. All right? And this is going to keep going on and on forever. So it's going to be equal to 0.3 with a line on top of it, showing that the 3 keeps repeating over and over again. So right here, we have 0.333 ... It's just going to keep going. And then underneath it, we're going to write 3/10 to help us compare. In the ones place, we have zeros, so we can't really compare that if it's the same. In the tens place, we have 2 3s, which is the same. And now underneath here, there's no number, so we're going to add zeros to help us compare. So up here we have a 3, down here we have a 0, meaning that this one is larger. So when we have 0.3 repeating and 3/10, 0.3 repeating is greater than 3/10. That means that 1/3 is greater than 3/10. All right, so here we have our final example, 21 over 75 and 2800ths. Now, we're going to convert this fraction to a decimal so that we could compare. That means that 21 goes on the inside, our numerator, and then our denominator goes on the outside. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 75 go into 2? Well, it doesn't, so we ask ourselves, how many times does 75 go into 21? So 75 does not go into 21. So we're going to put a 0. After the 21, we're going to add a decimal point and another 0. Make sure you bring up the decimal point. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 75 go into 210? Well, 2 times, because 75 times 2 is equal to 150, which we're going to write below, and then subtract. 210 minus 150 is 60. And then we're going to add another 0 because we have a remainder and bring it down. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 75 go into 600? And that's going to be 8 times because 75 times 8 is 600. Then we're going to subtract, and 600 minus 600 is 0, so we do not get a remainder. That means that 21 over 75 is equal to 2800ths. So we're going to write that below. Bring down this 2800ths, and notice how we have 2800ths twice. That means they are equal to each other. So 21 over 75 is equal to 2800ths. And that's it.